Well, thank you for coming. My name is Darren McAvoy. I'm an Extension Forestry Associate here at USU. This is the final and closing talk of the 2011 Restoring the West Conference, and will be provided by Jay O'Loughlin, Professor of Forestry and Policy Sciences from the University of Idaho in Moscow. This also serves as the College of Natural Resources seminar and the Natural Resources Week talk. To introduce Jay, Jay O'Loughlin has served as full-time director of the Policy Analysis Group at the University of Idaho's College of Natural Resources since 1989. A position created and funded by the Idaho legislature to provide objective analysis of natural resource issues important to Idaho citizens. Before moving to Idaho, Jay was tenured professor at specializing in forest policy and economics at the Department of Forest Science at Texas A&M. He earned MS and PhD degrees in forestry from the University of Minnesota and a business finance degree from the University of Denver. Before enrolling in forestry school, he was a U.S. Army artillery officer in Vietnam. Please welcome Jay O'Loughlin.
Thank you, Darren. It's been a great conference, and welcome especially to the students. Let me say a couple of words to the students before I launch in here. Natural resource issues are disagreements, are complicated, and they're socially important. That's why you chose to study natural resources, I'm sure. Thinking through these natural resource issues will make you a better citizen whether or not you get a job in natural resources. But if you really want a job in natural resources, stick with your goals, but be open to new ideas. I didn't get my ideal job until I was 35, and it was something that I'd never considered before, well, maybe a month before I got it. So hang in there. Be open-minded and keep on learning. I'm going to talk about the forest bioenergy carbon connection. That's sort of a loose outline of my presentation, but it's all captured in the University of Idaho steam plant, which is a wood-fired boiler that heats our entire campus, almost the entire campus, and has for close to 30 years. It saves Idaho taxpayers upwards of $2 million a year because we burn wood instead of natural gas. We burn sawmill residues from local mills and burn about 7 or 8 of those possum belly trucks each week during the winter. Yes, there are emissions that come out of the stack, and we'll talk about those during this presentation. The way you view those emissions depends on what your role is. So we'll talk about how the EPA views it, but I'll tell you right now, if they didn't like what we were doing, they'd shut it down. And there are perspectives and viewpoints on the forest bioenergy carbon connection, and we'll talk about those. Let's start with some of those perspectives. Here's the gold standard right here, the Nobel Prize, which went to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which said, and this is a take-home quote, this is a keeper, forest management strategy that produces an annual sustained yield of timber or energy will produce the largest sustained climate change mitigation benefit. The Ecological Society of America, in a report just a little more than a year ago, said there identified 8 strategies that can increase forest carbon storage. And 3 of those that I'm going to be talking about are using biomass energy from forest, using wood products for construction in place of concrete or steel, which use a lot of fossil energy to produce, and then fuel treatments to modify wildfire behavior. The forester's perspective is now captured in a brand new report that just came out last Friday. It's on the internet, and it will be published as a supplement to the Journal of Forestry very soon. Reducing global greenhouse gases requires increasing carbon storage in pools other than the atmosphere. Forests are part of the solution. We'll talk about that. Let's talk first about bioenergy. The world needs ever-increasing energy supplies to sustain economic growth and development. But energy resources are under pressure, and carbon dioxide emissions from the way we use energy threaten our climate. But we have options. Let's talk about carbon. Forests contain 3/4 of the Earth's plant biomass, and about half of that is carbon. So forests are going to play a key role in the global carbon cycle by capturing, storing, and cycling carbon. The carbon cycle, here's a poster. Forestry never looked so cool. And the URL for that is in the lower right. Carbon is absorbed, carbon is stored, and carbon is released. We'll go through each one of those quickly. But the heart of the whole thing is sustainable forestry. Everything spins off of that. Carbon is absorbed. Let's talk about how forestry can deal with that. As we think about alternative or renewable sources of energy, it's caused me to think differently about trees. Trees are towers made out of carbon that are covered with solar panels. Trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They give off the oxygen that we all need to breathe. They keep the carbon and use it to make the tower bigger. The atmospheric carbon dioxide is at uncharacteristically high levels. The rest of this are kind of words that put that last diagram into shape. If we look at the long wave cycles over the last 400,000 years of atmospheric carbon dioxide, they cycled on until the Industrial Revolution and fossil fuel burning. And that caused a steep increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. This fact has been statistically correlated with a climate change warming trend. So managing forests to sequester carbon adds another dimension to the enduring question of when should trees be cut. One strategy is harvesting at old age or not harvesting at all. Another is timber harvesting, making wood products that substitute for concrete and steel and thereby displace fossil fuel energy use and the emissions from fossil fuel energy use. This strategy will sequester more carbon than the no-harvest choice in high productivity forests. Let me demonstrate. And this is a report that we did on this a couple of years ago, a synthesis of existing information, which is what I do. This is the carbon uptake rates for Douglas fir in 4 regions of the West. And the red dotted line there, I put southeastern loblolly pine on there just for comparison purposes. Those Pacific Northwest West side, those are super forests. We all know that. And the other 3 regions of the West don't grow as fast. Trees don't get as big. But the key point here is that when trees are young, they uptake carbon very quickly. And this is a per acre measurement. And then at about age 30 or so, they begin to taper off, the rate of uptake. And then the carbon is stored. And as the annual uptake accumulates, we get the cumulative timber growing stock. Again, the super forests go way up there. The other 3 western regions of Douglas fir and loblolly pine by comparison. The cumulative carbon stock is very closely related to the cumulative timber stock. Here's a reference line that's going to be used on the next figure, but the same chart there. So the red line there is the no harvest. That's the maximum amount in the forest that carbon that can be put within the forest boundaries. Any management regime is going to sequester less carbon in the forest than not harvesting the forest. But just looking at the forest is not enough. You've got to look at, why are we doing the management? What happens to that timber that's harvested? So let's look at the 45-year rotation. There are a couple of others on there, but the research at the University of Washington from which this diagram was borrowed shows that the 45-year rotation is going to be the maximum carbon storage. So let's take that one, and you see a series of 45-year harvests here over a more than 160-year period, and that's the carbon pool just in the forest. Now, of course, we're harvesting that, making wood products, and the durable wood products store carbon for a long time. So we need to consider that carbon pool along with the forest pool. And then back on the diagram, the wood products, if we use them in place of fossil fuel intensive concrete and steel, we're actually substituting wood products for energy intensive building products. So there is a substitution effect. It's very real, and it's the payoff. It's big, because steel and concrete use a lot of energy to produce. So if we put the red line back on there, without harvesting down at the bottom, the maximum carbon is going to be the unharvested forest carbon pool. But if we consider the wood products and then the substitution of wood products for concrete and steel, we get more carbon storage if we consider all of the carbon pools. In the Journal of Forestry supplement that just came out, there's a very similar diagram to what I just walked you through, but it uses 80-year rotations instead of the 45-year rotations, but the same idea. So this is there available to you from the SAF task force that worked very hard on this report. Let's look again at the wood energy. Well, here's Mr. Green. He's out there in the woods, and he says, if only there was a viable, reliable energy source that's low in greenhouse gas emissions and plentiful. And of course, the point of this cartoon is over there on the right, nuclear. But after what happened in Japan last March, I don't think anybody is talking too seriously about increasing nuclear capacity. Germany is going to phase out all of their nuclear power plants. Well, Mr. Green is standing in biomass, and the nuclear plant is shaded by biomass. Biomass happens to be the largest renewable energy source. Now of all the sources of energy that we consume in the United States, the three big fossil fuel sectors there account for 83%, nuclear power, 9%, the other 8% is renewable. Of the renewables, biomass is more than half. And of the three different biomass sectors, wood is the largest one. And here's how this works. You harvest the timber, you make lumber, you kiln dry the lumber by taking the hog fuel and running the dry kilns. And this little sawmill up in Plummer, Idaho, also has a turbine that makes electricity from the same steam that runs the kiln dry and heats the facility. In the production of lumber, you also get clean chips, and you can put those on a truck and take them to somebody who wants clean chips, like this huge paper mill in Lewiston, Idaho, just down the road from where I live. And they do make useful products there. These mill residues are already fully utilized. So there's not an additional source of energy there. Now, just as wood bioenergy is a byproduct of a forest products manufacturing industry, wood bioenergy has its own byproducts. It's an opportunity to do three things, address three challenging issues. Number one, fire resiliency. Also, finding renewable energy. And third, revitalizing our rural communities by providing jobs. You can call this the triple win, and there's a bonus coupon, and that's the carbon management. The wood energy also substitutes for fossil energy. Then carbon is released. Trees don't live forever. Burning wood is nothing new. It's the most common form of biomass, and we've been using it since we lived in caves to heat those caves in our homes today. Dr. James Hansen is calling for a back-to-the-future return to one of the oldest fuels because we've exceeded what he considers the danger level for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Who's James Hansen? Well, former Vice President Al Gore won a Nobel Peace Prize and an Oscar for explaining global warming to the world. James Hansen explained global warming to Al Gore. He says, grow trees. They absorb the gas from the air, burn them instead of fossil fuels to generate electricity. He's particularly tough on coal. More on those fires. In the interior West, we have a problem with our national forests. And it's the overaccumulation of vegetation that fuels large and destructive wildfires. We've known that for a while, and we know that reducing those fuels can help. Woody biomass causes problems when it's not used. The lightning strikes, the fire gets started, and the sparks fly. This is an almost 100-year history of wildfires in the 11 western states, and they began to ramp up in the 1980s. Two causes: fuel accumulations and longer fire seasons and drier fuels because of climate change. In the future, the ecologist Steve Running at the University of Montana foresees an increase of perhaps double the area of wildfires over the next century in the western states. Well, every year, if we look at our 48 states, on average, we're offsetting at least 10% of carbon dioxide emissions because forests absorb that carbon. But every year, forest fires emit about 4 or 5% of all carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. This diagram from the Oregon Forest Resources Institute indicates 5 strategies for managing forests to deal with fire and climate change. And the number one is to reduce the stand replacing fires. Automobiles, our transportation vehicles, also release lots of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and they're fueled by fossil fuels. So if we look at the situation in Idaho, in an average wildfire year, the carbon dioxides from wildfires are equivalent to 2.6 million cars on the road. That's a lot of cars for a state that only has 1.3 million people. That's 2 cars for every man, woman, and child in the state. 2006 was a big wildfire year, and emissions in that year in Idaho were equivalent to 4.7 million cars. But even so, in 2006, Idaho's forests functioned as a large sink for atmospheric carbon. The forest absorbed more carbon than the wildfires emitted. Climate lends an urgency to fuels management to reduce wildfire hazards to the human communities that we live in and to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Implementation of fuel reduction will generate large volumes of biomass. This will require an additional workforce in our western forests. Since 2000 and the big fire years and the National Fire Plan came on, we've increased the amount of hazardous fuels reduction and landscape scale restoration activities from about 1 million acres up to 4, 5, and even more acres in 2009. Much positive activity, notes Doug Crandall, who's the legislative liaison for the Forest Service. The momentum shifted from a recognition that there's a gorilla in the room, which is the growth and the mortality and the removals relationship on our federal forests. He says treating 4 or 5 million acres a year just doesn't cut it. Take Idaho and Montana, for example. Look at the fire regime condition classes and treatable timberlands. The high-risk class 3, we've got 7 million acres total. If you look at the accomplishments that we're doing on the ground in our federal forests, in Idaho, we're averaging about 150,000 acres per year. Montana, about 100,000. Do the math. It's going to take 25 years just to treat the condition class 3. What happens 25 years after we treat lands this year? They need to be retreated. So we're just not doing it enough to get ahead of the game. Although the public lands really are a Western issue, every state in the Union has federal lands, but not to the extent that we have here in the West. So most of our timberlands in the Western states are national forest timberlands. Idaho, almost 3/4. National forest timber harvest throughout the nation began to decline rapidly in 1990. And although this goes to 2008, it hasn't come up since. Chief Emeritus Dale Bosworth, a graduate of the University of Idaho, noted in an article that he wrote that there are 73 million acres in national forest lands at risk, and he said the situation is simply not sustainable. Well, let's look at some numbers. Mortality and growth and their relationship as an indicator of forest health. So these are all the timberlands in the United States broken down into 4 ownership classifications on the left and 4 regions on the right. Pretty clear here that the national forests in the interior West are a special problem. Highest mortality rates in the nation. What about the future? There's a coordinated resource offering protocol now that the Forest Service has developed called crop projects. What's a crop project? It focuses on biomass removal as opposed to inventory on the public lands. And it provides removal data for each species and size class that the agencies plan to remove during the next 5-year period. It's designed partly to heighten public trust to provide support for biomass removal from the public lands. Well, I did an analysis of the crop projects that cover Idaho, and compared with past harvest records, the planned removals in Idaho over the next 5 years will remove 63% more material than in the past 5 years. So that's a step in the right direction, it sure is. But this assumes that all these planned projects will move through the NEPA process and they'll all be funded. Those are 2 very big ifs. But if they do happen, from our national forests in Idaho, the agency will remove 4% of the annual growth. The other 96% of the annual growth will stay in the forest. Here's 50 years of forest inventory change on our timberlands in Idaho. Big jump in the live growing stock volume between 1987 and 1997 reflects, you know what, the decline in national forest timber sales. The big change between 1997 and 2007 was, although harvests haven't come up, the growing stock went down. In part, that's because there are a lot of trees out there, and they're competing with the limiting factors on those sites. So the mortality, or the sound dead volume standing in our forests has almost tripled in that 10-year inventory period. It's waiting to burn. The growing stock volume, more than 80% of it is on the National Forest System lands. Almost all of the dead timber is on the National Forest lands. Well, when we do the treatments out there, about 1/4 of the materials from thinning is utilized for some purpose. Small diameter products or bioenergy. There are two significant obstacles or challenges for biomass utilization. One is to attract investment and entrepreneurs to build biomass facilities. They have to have some assurance of a long-term reliable supplier. They won't be able to find the financing for a project. That can be addressed through Forest Service planning and policies for removing biomass and making it available on the market. The second factor is the high costs of biomass collection, harvesting, collection, and transportation. So let me talk about that a little bit. When we talk about biomass, we almost always talk about the cost, but we don't talk about the benefits enough. That's my main point here. The cost, harvest, collection, and transport, yeah, it's expensive, but they're non-monetary costs in the use of fossil fuels, in the combustion of wood to make energy. There are greenhouse gases. There is some air pollution. And there is a potential land use change, the loss of forests, which can be overcome simply by practicing sustainable forest management, as State Forest Practices Act in Idaho and many other western states require. The benefits of removing biomass to restore desirable conditions are you do get small diameter products, and the low value product is energy, but we need more renewable energy in the states for heat, for electric power, for transportation fuels, and not just the states, but the whole world. There are other benefits that almost no one talks about, and these are the avoided costs from wildfire, modifying wildfire behavior with saving suppression costs, and the post-fire rehabilitation costs will be less because the fires won't be as destructive or large. Oh yeah, and he reminds me to say that what we have is a situation here where the tail, the costs, are wagging the dog, which are the benefits of doing the management. Well, we look to the future. This is what our Department of Energy sees in its energy outlook. It sees lots more biomass coming online to provide sources of energy. But we're going to have to deal with those issues that I just mentioned. State foresters are very concerned about this. They did a webinar just a month ago on the interactions among policy and incentives for land management, energy, and air quality, and the process for the Environmental Protection Agency's regulation of greenhouse gases from burning biomass under the Clean Air Act. And I was asked specifically to talk about that and the Manomet Center study. So here we go. This is really about carbon accounting. A new study came out of Massachusetts called Biomass Sustainability and Carbon Policy Study by the Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences. The day it was released, the Associated Press carried a story that wood power is a worse polluter than coal. Well, for my money, that's a worse headline since Dewey defeats Truman. The wood-burning power plants release more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than coal, and coal is a chief culprit of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, the president of the Manomet Center said, well, our team's accounting approach has worldwide relevance for informing biomass energy policy. So this, although the study was in Massachusetts, it's not just, the implications are much broader. Well, on July 15th last year, the EPA solicited information with 9 items, and 3 of these I analyzed and published a report on. And we'll deal with each of those very quickly. This report is available on my website, and this is some language from it. If policymakers set a single-purpose goal to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, it matters a great deal to forestry. Although one carbon dioxide molecule is just like any other, the fact that forests are renewable and fossil fuels are not is a big deal. Biomass carbon is part of an ongoing recycling process, so it's renewable, and it recognizes the innate ability of plants to absorb carbon dioxide. That's key here. Well, are these the right questions? I don't think so. There are two sources of excess CO2 in the atmosphere. By far the largest is fossil fuels over there on the right. The second is deforestation. We're not doing that very much in the United States. In fact, you could say we're not doing it at all. That's in other parts of the world. But if you look, there's no way to get the coal, oil, and natural gas emissions back underground. But the deforestation, just to the left of that black arrow, look at forest regrowth. It's more than double what the emissions from deforestation are. So the message there is quite simply, let's grow more forests, grow more wood in our forests. So if we continue on with the way we're managing forests in this country, this is a long-term look at it. We had carbon release as we cleared forests for development and agriculture, but since about World War II, our forests have functioned as a carbon sink. But if we continue our current trends in management, in about 100 years, our forests may not function as a carbon sink anymore. We'll take a look there. We don't have to continue on that track. We can implement policies to increase carbon sequestration in the forestry sector. And these are the questions we ought to be asking. Number one, how to maintain forests as carbon sinks. And number two, optimize the production of forest biofuels and biomaterials that help reduce demand for fossil energy. Carbon neutrality. Here's what the EPA says now. Burning of biomass is part of the natural carbon cycle. Plants take up carbon dioxide while they grow, return it to the air when they're burned. No net increase in carbon dioxide. A panel of scientists for the Climate Change Science Program said biomass fuels are carbon neutral. They complete a cycle that began with carbon uptake by vegetation. Biomass Energy Resource Center says wood combustion recycles carbon that was already in the natural cycle. And the net effect, no new carbon dioxide, as long as forests are sustainably managed. That's key. So I say rather than talk about carbon neutral, it's more accurate to say that biomass can be a low carbon source of renewable energy because it does take some fossil fuels to get that material out of the forest and into an energy plant. Alternative accounting approaches. The default assumption of carbon neutrality, as I just talked about, assumes that the impact of bioenergy or the alternative, assuming that emissions from burning biomass are the same as the emissions from burning fossil fuels, both of these points of view may oversimplify a complex issue. So the EPA called for information on alternative ways of accounting for this. And they asked specifically for information on the time interval and the spatial scale. So quickly on that, and it only has to be this short sentence from the ESA report last year. Management actions should be examined over large areas and long time periods. The Management Center report is over a 40-year period on a single stand. So if you just look at one stand, yeah, you get big fluctuations in carbon on the ground. If you look at a collection of stands, say a parcel, the swing isn't that big. But if you look at the landscape level, there's hardly any deviation at all, because the stand that you cut, there are many other stands that are growing and absorbing carbon. And we used to call this not the landscape level, but the woodshed or timber shed. You're not going to have an energy plant based on one stand or one parcel. It takes a lot of area to feed an energy plant. So the crux of the issue, though, really is the time frame. Manomet says that until trees regrow and recapture carbon, coal is a better choice than wood for producing electricity. Now you can see where the Associated Press headline came from. It came right out of the report. Carbon released by biomass combustion must be recaptured before bioenergy can be considered beneficial for the atmosphere. This is a time warp here, time frame warp. Over time, then, wood bioenergy will become increasingly beneficial. Sit down on a stump and think about that. I've done it a lot. I just don't get it. Manomet Center president said to the New York Times that society may be worse off burning biomass until the debt has been repaid by sequestering the released carbon. After some time, though, the cumulative dividend will reach a point where biomass burning is better than fossil fuels. I still don't get it. I think this is just an overcomplicated way of saying that bioenergy from a sustainably managed source today is better for the atmosphere than burning fossil fuels. We make decisions today, not 40 years from now. The carbon cycle, there's no start or end point. It just goes on and on and on. Carbon cycling occurs continuously over the entire Earth, so choosing a discrete time period is really the crux of the issue. Selecting the time a forest is harvested to begin counting carbon is arbitrary. It could just as easily begin when the trees were born rather than when they die. Comparison with fossil energy. This is derived in large part, all these arguments, from this seminal article in Science magazine on the climate accounting error. But even in that article it says each ton of wood consumed in a boiler instead of coal does not significantly alter combustion emissions. So comparing burning wood as compared to burning fossil fuels, Manomet says all bioenergy technologies look favorable when we use biomass waste wood compared to fossil fuel alternatives. But then the report focuses on whole tree biomass harvesting, and that's where the issue arises. The main reason that waste wood residues otherwise have no use and will be returned to the atmosphere in a short period of time anyway. This approach is strongly supported in the literature and including the Manomet report. So the EPA also says when biomass is co-fired with coal, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide emissions are lower. And the role of biomass in the carbon cycle is considered carbon dioxide emissions from burning some biomass with coal. The emissions will be lower than from burning coal alone. This is called co-firing. The idea that the combustion of coal is somehow better than the atmosphere, for the atmosphere than the combustion of wood just does not make sense. The current debate is likely to conclude, and this is my opinion, that burning wood to produce electricity is an improvement over burning coal now, but only if the feedstock comes from sustainably managed forests. A definitive life cycle analysis would help identify environmental trade-offs, and these analyses are ongoing. This graph is published in the new SAF report, where the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from coal and natural gas are the first two bars, and biomass is intermediate between them. If we consider the stance that the rest of the world has, that biomass truly does not add new carbon, you get that little tiny bit, less than 5% net biomass emissions, and that's from the collection and transport of biomass out of the forest. No biomass burn. There are several citizen organizations that are active on trying to keep biomass plants out of their communities. They claim it's dirtier than coal. More carbon dioxide? Maybe, but not according to that last life cycle analysis just published. More particulate matter? That is a big concern. Particulate matter can be easily scrubbed from modern biomass burning plants, modern coal plants too. More nitrous oxide. Here's a report published by the University of Tennessee based on U.S. Department of Energy data. Nitrous oxides from burning wood residues, way less than burning coal. Particulate matter from burning wood residues, less than burning coal. So who are you going to believe? Here's Dr. Hansen, a third author on this article. Life cycle emissions from coal, life cycle emissions from biomass. Enormous difference, but this is under the no new net carbon dioxide assumption that's assumed around the world. Air quality. I said I'd come back to this, which means we're almost done. The University of Idaho steam plant. Let's compare that with burning sawmill, the way we used to burn sawmill residues. Take them out in back of the plant, put them in a teepee burner to keep the sparks from flying, and just let all that air pollution out. Well, when the Clean Air Act came in, and the Environmental Protection Agency was given the responsibility for overseeing it in the early 1970s, no more of these. You don't see them anymore. They're gone. They're regulated out of existence. And the mills are using those residues instead to add value to their product by kiln drying it right there at the mill instead of sending it somewhere else. And you can make electricity with it too. The EPA, as I said earlier, put its stamp of approval on this biomass burning plant and many others in the United States. They meet air quality standards. You can talk about maybe the standards aren't tight enough, but that's an issue for another day. Now here is an issue. We're piling up slash, thinnings, and we're burning them out in the open. How's this different than a teepee burner? This is producing a lot of pollution. Not so bad in the sparser forests, the dry site ponderosa pine, but when you go up in the moist forest, moist conifer forest, you get huge slash piles and therefore huge amounts of pollution coming from those. Those particulate matter, somebody's going to be breathing those. So, in conclusion, the EPA is deferring its decision on whether to regulate biomass emissions for 3 years. And they are commissioning independent scientific analysis to help with their rulemaking whether you need a Clean Air Act permit to burn biomass for energy. So that's ongoing right now. There are 18 scientists who've been appointed to a panel just recently, and they have 3 years to make recommendations to the EPA. EPA director, appointed by the president, said in January, we will develop a common sense approach. Renewable homegrown power sources are essential and an important step to cutting the pollution responsible for climate change. Well, I think it was clear where she stood in January. I'm not sure where she stands today. She's leaving it up to the scientists to come up with it. So there's regulatory uncertainty out there. So folks who are interested in biomass burning facilities should probably proceed with caution and get legal opinion on what you might have to do to deal with the uncertainty. So read the SAF report. That's where our carbon is stored. And the objective is going to mean managing our lands differently than we do now. The heart of it's going to be sustainable forestry. And remember the triple win: fire resiliency, renewable energy, and jobs. Carbon management's important, but it's not likely to be the main objective for forestry. So just remember, biomass, we can either use it or we're going to lose it. It's inevitable. Forests do not live forever. Thanks for listening.